Now, Dr. Scott is a consultant trauma general acute care surgeon in Liverpool Hospital in Sydney, quite nearby. He's a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in Canada, Australia, Glasgow, and the American College of Surgeons. And he is the chair of the IAT SIC education programs in his region. He's also the head of the trauma research unit at Liverpool Hospital. He's well published, and he's got a deep interest in the RAPTOR Suite, hybrid theatres, and certainly in damage control surgery as well. Without any further ado, Dr. Scott.
I was asked to talk about the RAPTOR Suite and whether the RAPTOR Suite is the best way to stop bleeding. And I think the question is a fair one. I think it's a way to stop bleeding. I'm not yet convinced it's the best way to stop bleeding, but I'd like to go through some of the detail of that. I'd love to thank the organizers and the moderators and the speakers for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this. This is just a bit of an outline of what I'm going to be talking about when it comes to hybrids and the use of hybrids or RAPTOR Suite for trauma. We do need to talk a little bit about the outcomes, and that's an area that is a little bit light on data. And I'll talk a little bit about what works well and what doesn't. So first question, are hybrid suites useful for trauma? Well, I think as Dr. Boffard has discussed and mentioned a number of times, the most important aspect of treatment when it comes to the bleeding shocked trauma patient is to control bleeding. That's our top 10 at least priorities when it comes to these sorts of patients. Obviously, balanced fluid and blood product resuscitation are important, and contamination control in the management of damage control or in damage control tactics is also important. But controlling bleeding is the most important thing, and that's what I want to focus this part of the talk on. And in general, in the past especially, and in many places still, the operating theater has been the destination of choice when it comes to a bleeding, unstable trauma patient, and it's where major bleeding has always been definitively controlled. But at the same time, we know that with interventional radiology, it has been playing an increasing and an important role in hemorrhage control. And this has been recognized for a number of years. It's nothing new to us now, but there is even good data to support that as well. So the question really becomes when faced with a bleeding trauma patient is, where do you take this patient to first? They're in the resus room, they need to go somewhere. Is it going to be the operating theater where the hemorrhage is going to be most easily controlled? Or is it a type of arterial bleeding that's not going to be easily controlled in the operating theater, in which case interventional radiology may be the destination of choice? And depending on where you go, you may make a wrong decision, in which case you then have to transfer the patient somewhere else to optimize that bleeding control. A hybrid theater access, or having access to a hybrid theater, means the patient is always in the right place for hemorrhage control. And this is where the RAPTOR Suite, it's just an acronym, resuscitation with angiography, percutaneous techniques, and operative repair. That's where the RAPTOR Suite comes into being. The acronym was coined by a colleague of mine in Canada, in Calgary, Chad Ball. And as I said, there's no magic with a hybrid suite. It's an operating theater and an angiography lab. For all of those people who have done work in elective vascular or cardiothoracic or neurosurgery, it's nothing new. But the use of a hybrid for trauma was in its infancy when we first started talking about this some 10 to 15 years ago. So is there a critical need for a RAPTOR Suite? Well, there is a critical need for hemorrhage control. And we know that the timeliness of hemorrhage control is quite important. We know that patients continue to die of hemorrhage, and it's usually that time to definitive control of hemorrhage that is the problem. We also know that when it comes to interventional radiology and angioembolization, the delays are equally problematic. We like to think that it can all happen quite quickly, but depending on where we are and the availability of our interventional radiology colleagues or whoever might be performing the procedure, it takes most often a minimum of 90 minutes to get that. So there can be delays with angioembolization as well, but we definitely know that getting it done more quickly is better. So the advantages for the injured patient who needs hemorrhage control are that there are fewer delays with controlling the bleeding, and it also minimizes the inherent risk that you face when you're transferring a patient between those different venues within a hospital, between the interventional radiology suite and the operating theater. There's always a risk of ongoing bleeding during those transfer times, but also disruption of lines, disruption of tubes. So there are inherent risks just to transfer itself. Another advantage of RAPTOR is that the technology does allow for some rotational or CT-like imaging. It's not probably the same quality as the 256 slice scanners that many people have access to, but it does give you some imaging that you may not otherwise have time to access when you're faced with an unstable patient who just needs to get to a place where hemorrhage can be controlled. So we've had a few years of experience with this at the Liverpool Hospital in Sydney, where I work. We commenced planning for a building 15 years ago, but it took some years, and it was only 10 years ago that the new clinical building was completed, where we actually had a hot floor with co-located ICU, operating theaters, and interventional radiology suites. And in fact, in that design, 2 hybrid suites were included. They shared space between both the operating theaters and the interventional radiology suites, so that staffing from both sides could access them. The first hybrid suite was commissioned in 2011, and parallel work was commenced roughly at the same time in Calgary, under Chad Ball and Andy Kirkpatrick's leadership, along with John Courtbeat. So when we started using this, the initial indications for use were really any patient that had hemodynamic instability or physiologic instability who needed hemorrhage control, and the patterns of injury that we were looking for that we thought would be most useful, at least initially, were pelvic fractures, especially pelvic fractures with hemodynamic instability, patients with positive FAST, and that included a lot of patients that had really any form of abdominal or chest injury, and the vast majority of this was blunt injury. Patients with external bleeding could also be accessed in this unit. Much of that would be controlled operatively, but some of that could be controlled by endovascular means as well. So we were primarily taking unstable patients to the hybrid suite. Most times they were undifferentiated. We really didn't know for sure what the source of bleeding was. And as is often the case when we're seeing these patients in the resus area, we have limited information. So we're often relying on patterns of injury and playing the odds to a certain extent. This is just a photo of the suite in its infancy, when there really wasn't much in it other than a few things that we put in to try and work through some of the issues associated with its use, how we were going to configure it, where the different teams would be positioned. And we tried to put some effort into that to ensuring that when it did open, it was going to be functional. Some of the considerations for hybrid and trauma. I'd like to cover each of these areas just a little bit, because I think they're all quite relevant to the use of hybrids in trauma. And we'll start with outcomes. Now, outcomes are really an important aspect of everything and anything that we do, and clearly it's an important piece of the puzzle. Well, the pieces that we do know are things that I've mentioned already, that earlier control of hemorrhage is better, that catheter-based technologies or endovascular techniques can be better for bleeding control, and especially in some difficult to reach, as in surgical access, difficult to reach areas. In terms of direct evidence just demonstrating better outcomes for hybrids, there isn't that much, but we have published a couple of times recently, and one of the things that has come out of that is that the availability of a hybrid environment for some of these severely injured patients, and it's really a subgroup of seriously injured patients, did in fact reduce time to intervention, reduce the total procedural duration, blood product transfusion, and it also did salvage a small subset of patients who wouldn't survive otherwise. So what works and what doesn't in the hybrid suite? Well, faster transitions between the different modalities. Obviously, you're not moving the patient, so that can be faster as long as you've got both teams in place, or at least in the room. And if you don't, then you're going to have inherent delays. Better teamwork between different specialties, especially surgery and interventional radiology, but obviously anesthesia is in the middle of that as well. The rotational imaging has been effective in some patients, and don't forget, most of these patients are being taken to the hybrid without the cross-sectional or CT imaging. So often we don't know the status of the head if the GCS is decreased. So it does give us a little bit more information if we can use the hybrid robotic arm to get some of that information. And the quality of that is probably sufficient for immediate decision-making purposes, as in, do we need to decompress something in the head urgently? And it's especially in patients that may not have lateralizing signs, and obviously we haven't done a CT yet. Other aspects of equipment, some of the specifics, what type of table, is it a floating table that works best or a hybrid OR table? As the technology improves, I would say probably at this point a floating table, as long as you can put the arms on the side, which are also compatible with the X-ray tube. Then you can actually still attach things to the table, especially retractors, which in the older model, pure floating tables, you could not. Space and layout. Space is always a premium in these areas. This is not our hybrid suite. This is one that was from a promotional photograph. It looks fantastic. It looks massive. Room for everything. This is the reality of our hybrid suite. It was not probably big enough, and is often the case with these sorts of patients. You get a cast of thousands in addition to the operating team, which are often the smallest part of this equation. So you need more space than you think you do. The rotational imaging quality and consistency, that's an example on the left of a CT head that we were able to do intraoperatively in the hybrid suite. This is something that the promotional materials would suggest you can get, and I think in perfect situations you can get great quality, and to be fair, the imaging quality has improved over the years as well with the newer models. But you can still get adequate quality imaging to make those sorts of urgent decisions, but it's not going to mean that you will not do a proper CT when you've got access to one. What else needs work? I think teamwork and planning were a really important aspect of things, and I don't think anyone can probably do enough of that in getting ready to implement the function of a hybrid suite in your trauma patient management. And I think the need for simulation and education for all parts of the team, nursing, anesthetics, the surgical teams are really quite critical. And I think Calgary did some really great work on this. They were lucky enough in one way to have built a hospital that they couldn't occupy because the funding wasn't there yet. So they had the space, but it wasn't being used yet. So they were able to set up some mock hybrid units and start running through a few scenarios to get an idea of what would work and what didn't. And they spent quite a bit of time and published on it as well, and that's the reference at the bottom of the slide. They also looked at all sorts of things, different layouts of the room, looking at movement of people within the room and where there were potential pinch points or bump points, where there wasn't enough room or where there wasn't enough room for movement of the people within the suite. Cost is another important consideration for hybrids. These things aren't inexpensive. And of course, the cost can vary quite significantly depending on if your hybrid suite is a new build or whether you're trying to retrofit or refit an existing facility. I certainly would vote for decreasing costs, and generally the more expensive ones are the retrofitted or refitted ones. So if you've got a new build, that's probably a little bit easier to deal with in terms of the cost. And then there's also the issues of outright purchase of equipment or lease arrangements, and there's quite varying pluses and minuses depending on which way you take. A model of care. Now, I think a model of care is also quite an important aspect of things. Depending on whether the hospital you are in is part of a regional system of trauma care or just a local system of trauma care. If it's a single hospital, again, depending on how many patients are feeding into that region, how many trauma patients are arriving is going to then determine the expected number of suitable patients for this unit. And other things you need to think of as well is your particular trauma unit a consultant-led on-site team, or is it one where the consultant is on the phone, needs to come in, and that obviously can create delays as well with patient management. Another really important aspect is how means it's used for elective cases in addition to emergency cases, so it doesn't sit around idle. But then clearly you can have access issues if you have a patient that comes in, and again, much of the work that we see is unplanned, and when you need it now. But if there's an elective case ongoing, then that can block access, which means you have to then revert to the old-fashioned decision-making in terms of doing interventional radiology first or doing an operating theater procedure first. If it's an exclusive use arrangement, then you need to make sure you've got the volume to support that. Certainly access is easier, there's no issues of ownership, but you can't really let it sit there empty because it's a pretty expensive investment if you're not using it frequently enough. Plus you can also run into issues of training and familiarity for some parts of the team. There are unresolved considerations as well. Who does the endovascular work? I think there are aspects of it that can be done by trauma surgeons. That's probably the embolization aspects, or at least the balloon related aspects. But if you're looking at stents and all that sort of work, I think that's quite a specialized area that really requires people that are doing it all the time. And how are we determining adequacy of training in these situations? I think that varies as well. So in summary, there's no magic about hybrid operating theaters or RAPTORs. They are a place where hemorrhage can be controlled, and they're a very potent tool. And they do have an advantage for specific subgroups of very high risk bleeding trauma patients. They do save time. There are obviously advantages with less decision-making errors because the optimal venue for hemorrhage control is a single place. And the technology is great, but clearly it is evolving. And any time we install these sorts of things, we want to make sure we future-proof things as best possible. If you're thinking of getting one, I think you need to do your homework. You need to think about your local model of care within your regional system of trauma care. You need to plan its implementation carefully. And I think most importantly, and probably one that we didn't focus on enough when we first built ours, is the training and education of those that are going to help within it. And with that, I will stop there and thank you again to the conveners for allowing me to participate in this webinar.